Do you think execution by guillotine is cruel? What if I told you that an English king was executed in such a way that not a single trace remained on his body? And that his death was so painful that even the executioners turned away, unable to bear what they saw. This is how the story of Edward II begins, a monarch whom history tried to erase from memory. A king who was not a conqueror, not a hero, and not even a real man by the standards of his time. He was someone who was despised, mocked, and ultimately tortured to death in a way that is difficult to even describe. Modern historians often call him a failed ruler. But that is too mild a description. Edward II was a monarch who did not simply lose his throne. He lost his humanity. You've probably heard about his lover, Piers Gaveston. About his wife, Queen Isabella, the one who went down in history as the she-wolf of France. About the uprisings, betrayals, and humiliations. But what it all ended in didn't even make it into the school textbooks. Because the truth is too ugly, too humiliating, and perhaps too hellish to be believed. They say his death was quick. They say it was an accident. But what happened that night at Berkeley Castle eventually became one of the most terrifying legends in English history. The king could be physically destroyed, but the memory of his execution outlived all his enemies. And perhaps that is why history tried so hard to forget it. He was called the clumsy king. But in reality, Edward II was too lively for a world where monarchs were expected to be cold-minded and aloof. He laughed too sincerely. He touched too gently. He trusted too much. And that was his curse. Piers Gaveston, a name that even after 7 centuries sounds like a sin. Handsome, witty, dangerous. He was not just the king's favorite, he became his universe. They say they hunted together, feasted until dawn, and shared not only the table but also the bed. Chronicles say that Edward did not hide his feelings. He caressed Gaveston in front of the courtiers, calling him, "my dear friend," and "my brother of the heart." For medieval England, this was not just a scandal, it was a challenge to God. The lords whispered, England is ruled not by the king, but by his lover. Every gift Edward gave to Piers, every title, was a nail in the coffin of his own power. Gaveston received land, money, even royal jewels. And when Queen Isabella, young, intelligent, and proud, saw her husband humiliating her in public, something between them broke irrevocably. The Chronicles wrote that she found them alone, and from that moment on, a cold hatred was born in her heart. "I am queen in name only," she told those around her, "but the real power lies in his bed." Mockery spread through England like poison. The nobles began to openly despise the king. A rebellion began. And when the crowd reached Halves Ton, even his enemies could not describe what they did to him. He was tortured, dismembered, and his body was put on display as a warning to those who forget their place. He was tortured, dismembered, and his body was put on display as a warning to those who forget their place. Edward wept like a child over the mutilated body of his lover. Chronicles wrote that his roar was the voice of the devil from the depths of the human heart. And then he swore. "They took my love away from me. Now I will take everything away from them." But history has its own sense of irony. Because the next blow of fate will not be an uprising or the betrayal of the lords. It would be a woman who knew his weakness better than anyone else. Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France. And her revenge would be cold. After the death of Piers Gaveston, England did not yet know that the real storm was just beginning. The king plunged into despair, became suspicious, and took revenge on everyone who had ever raised their voice against him. His court descended into chaos, favorites changed like masks, and blood was shed more and more often. Queen Isabella remained silent. But a woman's silence at court is not obedience. It is anticipation. They say she began to weave her web even as she stood next to the body of the murdered Gaveston. Outwardly, she was a submissive, gentle, royal wife. Inside, she was a wolf preparing to strike. When Edward's situation became hopeless, Isabella left for France, officially, on a diplomatic mission. But everyone knew it was an escape. And it was there that she met Roger Mortimer, a fugitive, a rebel, a man whom the king had once thrown into the dungeon. Their acquaintance was the beginning of a legend in which love and betrayal merged into one poisonous drink. Chronicles wrote that Isabella fell into the arms of the man who hated her husband the most. Together, they conceived the impossible, to overthrow the English king with their own hands. In France, they gathered an army, money, and allies. The scandal was so loud that even the Pope demanded that she return to her husband. She replied coldly, "I will return. But not as a wife, as a judge." In the fall of 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed on the shores of England. The uprising broke out like dry grass. The lords who had served the king yesterday now swore allegiance to his wife. Edward fled. His former state crumbled under his feet like rotten wood. He was captured in Wales, wet, exhausted, in rags. His former guard spat at his feet. They say that when Isabella found out about this, she just smiled and whispered, "My dear kitten, finally in a cage." He was thrown into the dungeon of Berkeley Castle. There, where the walls breathed dampness, and the screams at night were indistinguishable from the howling wind. The king who once sat on the throne now slept on rotten straw, and the only witnesses to his fall were rats. Meanwhile, Isabella entered the palaces where he once ruled. They say she stopped by the throne, ran her hand over the carved backrest, and whispered, "You called me your precious kitten. Now I am your executioner." Isabella was a she-wolf from France. A woman who made betrayal her crown. And then the story gets even darker. Because ahead lies a night in the dungeon. A night after which even the stones of Berkeley Castle began to moan. They say his death was merciful. They say that the former king simply faded away in solitude, in his cell at Berkeley Castle. But no one believed this fairy tale. Because even for medieval England, his death had a too convenient smell, the smell of a hidden crime. Autumn 1327. Berkeley Castle. The night is so quiet that you can hear water dripping in the corner. It smells of dampness, manure, and the sweat of people who have long ceased to be human. Edward II sits on a stone bed. The cold seeps through his body. All that remains of his royal robes is a rag, which he uses to cover his feet. They say he muttered prayers. They say he called out to Isabella, not as an enemy, but as a woman he once loved. But that evening, other sounds echoed through the castle. Quiet footsteps. The rustling of metal. 2 men were ordered to dispose of the former king so as not to leave a single wound. His executioners were ordered to place a horn between his body and the red-hot iron so as not to leave burns on his skin. The executioners did not ask why. In those days, questions were dangerous. They just lit the fire. And the smell of red-hot iron filled the chamber faster than prayer. Historians disagree on what happened next. Some wrote that he was suffocated with a pillow. Others wrote that his body burned from within. And Geoffrey Le Baker's chronicle tells of something that made even the stones of Berkeley tremble with fear. When the fire turned white, one executioner raised an iron rod. And then the chamber was filled with a scream, not human, not animal. A scream that, according to eyewitnesses, stopped the night. They say Isabella was not present. But her servants heard the bell in Berkeley Tower ring 3 times at that very moment. And no one touched the rope. They say that when she was told of his death, she just smiled and whispered, "Now he is truly pure." His body was buried without honors, at night, in the rain. No coffin, no cross, no farewell. And a few days later, the smell of burning was still in the dungeon. And the monks who came to pray said that at night they could hear moans, like breathing. They say that even 100 years after his death, the monks of Berkeley refused to spend the night in that cell because they believed that Edward's soul had not found peace. He died without a single wound, the chroniclers wrote. But there was nothing human left inside him. Perhaps it is just a legend. Perhaps his death was invented to discredit Isabella. But it was the legend that became immortal. Because people remember not what was, but what keeps them awake at night. It seemed that everything was over. The king was dead. Isabella and Mortimer celebrate their victory. They rule on behalf of little Edward III, the son of the man they betrayed. The palaces are once again filled with music, silver clinks, and royal seals are stamped without hesitation. But when the sun goes down, these palaces become cold. Colder than anywhere else in England. They say Isabella woke up at night screaming. Screaming that came not from outside, but from inside her head. She ordered the bells to be silenced so she wouldn't hear them ringing, because each one reminded her of that night in Berkeley. People whispered that her chambers smelled of smoke, even when the fireplaces were not lit. Servants saw the shadow of a man in tattered clothes following her down the corridor and disappearing when she turned around. Mortimer, meanwhile, was becoming more and more arrogant. He sat next to her on the throne, ordered executions without trial, and signed decrees with her hand. The queen who had once conquered England was now turning into a puppet herself. And then history came full circle. Their son, Edward III, had grown up. And, like all children who had been protected by lies, he wanted the truth. In 1330, the young king ordered Roger Mortimer to be arrested, right in the middle of a banquet. The man who had once tortured his father was now being led to his execution. Chronicles say that Mortimer begged for mercy, but there was none. His body hung on the gallows near the tower for 3 days, so that everyone could see how those who touched the crown without permission were punished. And Isabella was not executed. She was locked up in a convent, where she lived for another 28 years. They say she carried only one thing with her, a silver crucifix in which a tiny heart was hidden. A heart that people whispered belonged to Edward II. When she died, a note was found in her cell. It contained only 2 lines. He comes to me every night. And I am no longer afraid. After that, the convent was called the House of Silence. Because everyone who heard voices there swore that it was a man's moan and a woman's whisper intertwined. They say that the winds above Berkeley Castle sometimes still carry the smell of smoke. And when the bells ring at midnight, the same sound that once stopped the night echoes. They wanted to erase him from history. But now everyone remembers his death. And their names are just footnotes at the bottom of the page. Because history knows no worse punishment than when those who wanted to destroy become forgotten themselves. Edward II did not die as a king. He died as a legend, and that is why history still does not dare to pronounce his name without a shadow of fear.